All right, well, let's open together with the word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Gracious and loving God, thank you for this opportunity to gather and to exercise our brains and our hearts. You are people who call our whole selves to be followers of you, and so we thank you that this church strives to grow our whole selves, to grow our minds, our hearts, our souls. God, bless our time together, bless our conversation. May it be fruitful, and may it shed some light on the ways that you're calling us to be your faithful followers. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. You all have shown up for an adult ed forum called The Things We Never Read. Did you know that?
I'm in the wrong place.
Oh!
You've read it all.
Yes.
And then the subtitle is less exciting, an exploration of the texts that don't appear in the Revised Common Lectionary. But I'm the lucky one who gets to kick off this forum. It's going to be 3 weeks myself. And then Dan, are you next week or the following week?
I think I'm next week.
And then Dan is next week, and then Reverend Doodle Harris, the chaplain at Hastings College, will be the 3rd week. And we were invited to pick texts that we don't often preach on or we don't read in worship, but that we're doing a little bit of education around the Revised Common Lectionary. So the first question is, how do your pastors pick the text that they read in worship and preach on? Do you know? Does anybody know?
It's not a rent a sermon or anything?
It's not a what?
Rent a sermon?
I haven't done that yet. I've been here 6 years. I've preached 200 sermons at this church. I haven't rented one yet.
That's good.
Although I will tell you, this is an interesting side note. I am going to rent a sermon this year. I've asked our archivist to go back through the sermons, and I'm going to actually, with attribution, preach some of Cy Kessler's sermons this year in celebration of the 150th anniversary of the church.
Oh, yeah.
So our archivist went back and looked at important points in history and what Cy might have preached at those times. And so you're going to hear echoes of Cy Kessler this year, once or twice, and maybe some other pastors who have preached in this church.
More than usual. I hear him in the halls all the time. Late at night, ooh, not good.
Yeah, that's why I avoid this place late at night. So, not read the sermon. That's
Is there such a thing that exists out there?
oh, I mean, there's lots and lots of sermons out there, and there are pastors who do
Just
these
take them.
other sermons, sometimes with attribution, sometimes without. It happens.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't there a lectionary?
Lectionary,
Yeah.
yes.
And I don't know why, but it seems like, I thought it was just a Catholic thing when I was a Catholic, but apparently.
It used to be.
ABC, right?
Right.
Years ABC, man.
Uh-huh.
I can skip the whole first half of my, no. So, it is a lectionary. Let's see if I can get that out of the way.
4th century.
So a lectionary is simply a collection of readings or selections from scriptures that are specifically designed to be used during the worship service, to be read and then also to be preached on. And so this idea of a lectionary, so far as historical scholars can tell, dates back to the 4th century. That's when the church, and in the 4th century, there was just the church. There was no Roman Catholic Church or Protestant church, it was just church. And scholars go back and say, starting in the 4th century, that's when the church was consistently reading scriptures in a particular way in the form of a lectionary. And back then it was usually continuous reading. So January 8th, we're going to read Matthew 2, 1 through 8. And then next week, January 15th, we're going to read Matthew 2, 9 through 15. And you just work your way through the Bible. And that's a continuous lectionary. And that is one way that some churches pick texts and use texts. But that practice of assigning particular readings to particular Sundays throughout the church year is something that has been handed down through the history of the Christian church. And so, let's hope. So, you said Roman Catholics, and they were the ones who had a lectionary, and they radically reworked their lectionary during Vatican II. And they came up with the, anybody speak Latin? Ordo Lectionum Missae, which turned the lectionary into a 3-year cycle of readings. And they started doing that in 1969 in the Roman Catholic Church. And Protestants were like, hey, that's a good idea. And so they borrowed it. And Protestants in the 70s started using the Roman Catholic lectionary that had come out of Vatican II. Protestants did a lot of that. Of some of the changes that came out of Vatican II, Protestants were pretty keen on. It also was a time where we took back some historical church traditions and things. Not that they were painted as Roman Catholic traditions, but they were traditions of the church, predating the Catholic. And so we started doing things like Ash Wednesday again, right? Which we hadn't done for a while. But one of the things we did was borrow the Roman Catholic lectionary. And enough churches were doing this in the 70s, they said, why don't we Protestantize this a little bit? Because the Roman Catholic lectionary includes a lot of Catholic feast days and saint days, which we don't celebrate in Protestant churches. So there was a group called the Consultation on Common Texts that got together in the 1970s, and they took the whole Roman Catholic lectionary, removed some of the feast days, but they kept much of it. And they created the Common Lectionary, which you can't see here, but was it was 1983, I think, is when the Common Lectionary started. And then we used that for 9 years. And over those 9 years, we got feedback and did studies, and that led to the creation of the Revised Common Lectionary, which was finalized then in 1992, and that's what we still use today. So, and the Revised Common Lectionary and the Ordo Lectionum Missae are almost always the same with the exception of Catholic feast days. So it's a 3-year cycle of weekly readings that are used by Catholics and mainline Protestant churches around the world. Majority of Christians worldwide, and this is one of the things I love, is that people are hearing the same scripture no matter where they're worshiping in the world. And this is true around the world. I've traveled all sorts of places, and they often use the lectionary. And so I know that the church in Africa, or the church in Syria, or the church in Asia is using some. So it's built around the seasons or the liturgical calendar. You guys are often here the Sunday before we start Advent, and Damon often preaches that Sunday because it often falls during Thanksgiving, and Damon says, Happy New Year! You've experienced that, I assume. And that's because the lectionary year or the liturgical year starts in Advent. That's when our church year begins. The last Sunday before Advent is Christ the King Sunday or Reign of Christ Sunday, and then we roll into Advent, which is when our year begins. And so that's, then the longest section of time is the ordinary time, which is from the season after Pentecost all the way through until Advent. There's a few special days in there, but it's generally how that works. So, so each week, this Revised Common Lectionary offers us 4 readings that are thematically linked. It's built around the Gospel, so the Gospel reading, and then there's an Old Testament reading, a Psalm, and an Epistle. And then, so you're right about years A, B, and C. Year A is the year we generally read through the Gospel of Matthew. Year B is generally the year we read through the Gospel of Mark, and year C is when we generally read through Luke. And then John gets scattered throughout all 3 years, A, B, and C, and oftentimes around Lent and Easter, around Advent, there are John readings that fit really well. And so even though we're sticking generally with one gospel, you'll get a smattering of John here and there. And so that's how it's built. And then the Old Testament readings, the Psalm and the Epistle are generally thematically linked to whatever the gospel is talking about. And so this week, when you guys go to worship, I'm going to read a passage from Isaiah, which is the Old Testament reading, and you're going to hear echoes in the passage from Isaiah in the Gospel of Matthew reading that we read. The Gospel of Matthew reading this week is the baptism of Jesus. What you're going to hear in Isaiah is borrowing of words almost, or echoes of the two, and that happens a lot. And that's very intentional. A bunch of biblical scholars got together and said, okay, this is what the reading the Gospel of Matthew is. Where do we hear about this in the Old Testament? And then they pull those passages, and that's how they line it up. So, what are the benefits of using this Revised Common Lectionary? One is consistency, right? We're doing the same thing year after year, and we're sharing this, we're also connecting the stories in the Bible, right? Biblical scholars who are much smarter and more studied than I have done the work to study to say, okay, if we're reading this gospel passage, what is this referring to back in the Old Testament? Or what psalm might this reference? Or when does Paul refer to this in his epistles? Somebody's done that work for me. So, and I don't, as your pastor, I don't have time necessarily to be a biblical scholar. I study biblical scholars. I rely on biblical scholars, but I am not a biblical scholar in my own right. So there's some consistency. It helps a ton with planning. And this is the thing in a church our size, it's a real gift to know what passages are going to be read throughout the year. And so our choir director, who was Robin until last week, Robin would know generally what the theme for the Sunday was or what I was preaching on. So Robin could go through his music library and pick an anthem. And Robin did this masterfully. And so often the anthem so beautifully aligned with whatever the scripture was and whatever I was preaching on. And I often attributed that to the work of the Holy Spirit, but it was also hard work done by Robin. And Brett Epperson is already doing that, our new choir director. He was spent hours in the choral library and is already working to do this stuff. So it helps us plan. It also helps us,
Well, I was just going to say, in our hymnal is also set up and aligned with the lectionary. And if you have a specific reading for that Sunday, you can also reiterate that with the hymns, and they're outlined in the back what scriptures or where the hymn texts originate.
You just gave me my secret is how I picked my hymn.
Sorry.
But most of them have sat in the pews and thumbed through the hymnal on a particularly boring sermon day, and they've actually found that lectionary, I bet. But yeah, it's right there in the back of the hymnal. So, and that is generally how I pick the hymns. And when I often throw new hymns at you, it's because the theme of the hymn so perfectly aligns with the scripture or the sermon that I want it to be reiterated. And my wife, who is an education professor at Hastings College, talks about differentiated learning. And she says, not everybody, Greg, is going to get something out of a sermon. So you need good images with your sermon, and then you need to reinforce it with a good hymn. And so I hear her voice in my ear each week as I'm picking my hymns and picking my sermon illustrations. So planning, it helps a great deal with our Christian Ed too. And so a lot of the Christian Ed curriculums that we use are built around the Revised Common Lectionary. And so Rose does not have to create Christian Ed curriculum each week. It's created for her. And so that helps a lot. And then it helps with the preaching, and it helps Dana and I when we go back and forth. So there's a huge benefit of breadth, because if I did not preach the Revised Common Lectionary, I would not preach on a lot of the texts that they asked me to preach on. But it forces me out of my comfort zone. What my preaching professor said, every pastor has particular Bible passages they love. Our Bible is called the canon, and every pastor has a canon within the canon. We all have our passages that we like. And those would be my go-to passages. And if I wasn't preaching a Revised Common Lectionary, you guys would hear me preach on Micah 6:8 at least once a month, right? And you'd hear me preach on Matthew 25 at least once a month, because this is my canon within a canon. But the lectionary forces me to only preach on those a few times a year instead of once a month, as I would like to. So that's a really good thing. And it also provides more musical opportunities because, again, we're getting a broader range of subjects and material, which allows for different hymns and different anthems for the choir, that sort of thing. And then finally, connection. I think I love that it connects us to Christians around the world. It also connects us with our past. It connects us with the story of God's people throughout the ages. So these are all wonderful benefits of the Revised Common Lectionary. And how we use it here, I think you all know this. We generally use it September through May. So the pastors will use the Revised Common Lectionary. We don't usually preach on all 4 passages. We'll usually read 2. I'll often convert the psalm into a call to worship so that just that language is in your ears. And then our Christian Ed curriculum is built around it, and then the music is selected based on it. It determines which gospels we're using based on the year. So you guys are going to hear a lot of Matthew this year. I'm very excited because when the Matthew year comes up, the Sermon on the Mount is in the Gospel of Matthew, and I love the material in the Sermon on the Mount. And it actually falls between Christmas and Lent. And so in late January, early February, you guys are going to hear the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of my favorite, one of my canons within a canon, if you will. helps us to explore text and keep up with liturgical seasons. And then, as you know, we kind of go off lectionary in the summertime with the sermon series. We do like the summer sermon song series or the sermon series on children's literature. And that's a break for all of you. It's also a break for us as pastors. Normally, when I write a sermon, I start with the text. I read the text through a few times, and then I read commentaries based on the text. With the summer sermon song series and the children's book sermon series, I start with something else, like a song or a children's book, and I read through it, and I think, okay, what text does this speak to? And then I connect the two. And so it's a very different way of being, and it gives my brain a break, and I get to think differently for the summertime, and so that's a benefit. Also, our music programs and our Christian Ed programs are going on, so we're not trying to align things like that, so it makes it a little bit easier. All right, any questions at this point? You guys are waiting to hear about what we don't read, aren't you? But this is a good intro, and now you guys have this groundwork so that for when Dan and Doodle both lead you. So some texts are missing. You can't cover the whole Bible in a 3-year cycle. In fact, in the Old Testament, less than half of the Old Testament is read in the Revised Common Lectionary. About 3/4 of the New Testament is read in the Revised Common Lectionary. And which ones were left out and why? Some of them are redundant. And what we're going to be talking about today is often they say it's left out because of redundancy. I disagree with that. And then some are difficult to use in worship. There are certain stories in the Bible that are really good to sit down with a group and talk about for an hour, where we can really wrestle with them and have back and forth discussions and sort of use the Socratic method and that sort of thing. But they don't work really well in the context of a 12-minute sermon that's more of a one-way communication. And so those are left out of the Revised Common Lectionary. And so that is what we will be studying for the next 3 weeks, are the texts that are left out. And we may do this again. If this seems to get some traction and you all enjoy this, then we've picked three texts, and we may do it again. I have a friend who's a pastor in Gothenburg, and she's planning her summer sermon series, and she's doing the same thing, but she's going to do it the whole summer. She's going to preach texts that don't appear in the Revised Common Lectionary. And I will tell you too, oftentimes when I'm doing the summer sermon song series or the children's book, I'll try to pick texts that are not in the Revised Common Lectionary for those, just so that we hear them, if I can. So, all right. So what I'm going to be presenting to you are the really thrilling books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which get completely skipped in the Revised Common Lectionary. So, apart from what's up here, what do you all know about 1st and 2nd Chronicles? I assume that you all read it every year. It's in particular the genealogies. The first 9 chapters of 1st Chronicles is just who begat, who begat, who begat, who begat. And it starts with Adam, and it goes all the way to King David, because you got to connect the Adam story and the Davidic lineage. And so you can imagine how many begats there are there. It's 9 chapters of begats. So that would be one of the reasons that probably the first 9 chapters of 1st Chronicles is not included in the Revised Common Lectionary. Because if I stood up and said, we're going to read 1st Chronicles chapter 1, verse 6 through 12, and I'd say, so-and-so begat so-and-so, so-and-so begat so-and-so, so, and I'd just do that. And we could do that all day. We could do that for 9 chapters. So there are a genre of books in the Old Testament that are called the historical books, and the Chronicles falls in the historical books. And so what they say is that these historical books attempt to recount perhaps actual events of history. They account lineage, and they tell the story of kings, and then also tell the story of God's people. And so these fall in this genre of the Old Testament of historical books. The authorship of Chronicles is attributed to Ezra, who's one of the prophets. Ezra has his own book in the Bible. And Ezra is also thought to have written the book of Nehemiah, and Ezra is thought to have written 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And we, in our Bible, call it 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It was split into 2 initially. The original manuscripts of this they found, it's all one book. And in some manuscripts they found, Ezra and Nehemiah are also part of that book. So it's Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, are all one. So there is a sort of a narrative thread between those 4 books of the Bible. Ezra and Nehemiah are not considered historical books, they're considered prophets. Am I right about that?
Yeah.
First and Second Chronicles are considered historical books, but there's a thread, a narrative thread that runs through all 4 of those books, and they used to all be condensed into one. And then the people of God started separating them out for a variety of reasons. So, and the books they chronicle or tell the story of God's people. A couple of different scholars that I read said Chronicles is the equivalent of Acts of the Old Testament. So Acts in the New Testament, the full name of the book of Acts in the New Testament is the Acts of the Apostles, and it chronicles or goes through from Jesus' ascension to the start of the early church. Chronicles covers a much, 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 much longer history, but it does tell the story of God's people. And so that's, I thought that was an interesting comparison. And then one scholar said it can kind of be thought of as a miniature Old Testament. I'm not sure that I'm crazy about that, but I thought that was interesting because of the way that it does try to tell the history of God's people from Adam, at least through King David and then a few kings after David. And so in terms of the telling of the actual sort of historical events, it does that. It doesn't do it in quite the same detail, but that's things. And then I had already mentioned that it presents the most extensive collection of these genealogical tables. First Chronicles 1 through 9 are not fun reading, unless you really like memorizing names and dates, like 9 chapters of names and dates, although they don't have actual dates in there. So this is a little more. Ezra, who it's tribute to, led a group of exiles back to Jerusalem in 458, and from there is when he compiled or wrote the Chronicles. And the emphasis here is less about the history of people and more about the history of people with God, right? The importance of religious purity, the proper place of the law, and the significance and sanctity of the temple and the priesthood. It omits a lot of the details of the kings and prophets, and instead focuses on God's people and their relationship to God. In First Chronicles, King David is the primary subject. In Second Chronicles, it's the house of David, so David's lineage, which is important. And we studied a lot of David's lineage during the season of Advent as we tried to connect the story of Jesus back to the Davidic lineage. Chronicles does this in depth in really, really profound ways. So, yeah,
Are you going to say anything about the stories of David that aren't in Chronicles?
Well, it omits some of his more sinful nature, doesn't it? Yeah.
Right. It's like it's the G-rated version. The story of Bathsheba is not in Chronicles. So with the emphasis on the importance of religious purity, the last thing you wanted to have was a king who was, the model of righteousness and justice, committing adultery, committing murder, and all those things. So let's just take that out.
It definitely whitewashes David's.
Yeah, which is an interesting question about how history is written, right? I mean, technically, this isn't history. This is mythology that's being written. It's
right.
They're trying to create a picture in order to give people a sense of their identity vis-a-vis David, but
right.
They don't include the David and Bathsheba story.
Yes.
It's funny.
Yeah. So another reason that that as I was reading about the Revised Common Lectionary and why this was omitted is that there's a lot of redundancy between Chronicles and Kings, because Kings actually covers the same time period and basically the same material, sort of historical material, right? But what I appreciated was this, like comparing Chronicles and Kings, and this was one of the scholars I read. So in Kings, the history of the nation is given from the throne. In Chronicles, it's given from the altar, right? You move from the throne into the temple. And so Kings tells the story of human history. Chronicles tells the history of God and God's people. The palace is the center in Kings, the temple is the center in Chronicles. Kings records the political history, Chronicles records the religious history. Kings gives us humanity's viewpoint, and Chronicles gives us God or God's people's viewpoint. So that's, but But if you just did a dry reading of Chronicles and Kings, you would see that there's a lot of similarities as it goes through the different kings and what they've done. Now, my next slide is terrible because it's got way too much text on it, but it's just an outline of First Chronicles. And you don't need to like zoom in on this except for me to just say, so the genealogies, first 9 chapters, starting with Adam all the way to King David, right? And then you have David's anointing as king and his ascension to the throne, and then all the things that happened with David, right? His ascension, the capture of Jerusalem, the heroes of David, and then you have his reign, David and the Ark, David's wars, David's census, David's preparation for the temple, David's organization of the Levites, David's civil leaders, David's last instructions to the people, David's offerings and worship, and then at the very end of First Chronicles, you have David passing on to Solomon, who takes over as king. So that's First Chronicles. And then Second Chronicles is, you have the reign of Solomon for the first 9 chapters. Solomon's a big deal, King Solomon. And then you have the kings of Judah. This is where it's like, so, and yeah, it just goes on and on. Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah, it goes on, and then you have War of the Kings of Judah. And then finally, you get to the end and you have the decree of Cyrus. So that's kind of the material that's covered in there. And you can see perhaps why this was not part of the Revised Common Lectionary. So any questions, comments, feedback? If you want some really interesting names, these are the ones that I can throw to. If ever one of you is going to read scripture for me, I'll make sure I pull from Chronicles and we do AMAZIAH, and I'll hand it to you right before you have to.
I was thinking of a cat named Jehoshaphat.
Jehoshaphat,
yeah.
Might be kind of fun.
Is that one of the cats in Cats?
Oh, is it? I don't remember.
I look to you.
I don't
You
know.
like
I've
musicals
never,
and you like cats.
I've never seen Cats.
Says Hamilton sweatshirt.
I know.
I find it interesting that it's the history of, it's the political history that makes it into the lectionary, not the, right.
Yeah, and First and Second Kings is, I mean, there's like, I said less than half of the Old Testament is in the lectionary. First and Second Kings gets a few mentions.
Okay.
Right? And it's not the political history that makes it, it's prayers. And that's where, when I dug into Chronicles, I thought there are parts of these that should belong in the lectionary, or could belong in the lectionary, or that we should study as God's people. And so that's what we're going to spend the last part of this class doing. I pulled a passage from First Chronicles and a passage from Second Chronicles that I think would be appropriate to include in worship and to study and to use in the lectionary. So the first one is David's prayer in First Chronicles 29. So this is the very end of David's life. He's about ready to pass the baton on to Solomon. And he has this, what I consider to be a really beautiful prayer. And so I've got it spread out over 3 slides, but I'll go ahead and read it out loud. I'll read the first slide and then we'll see if anything jumps out at us, and then the second slide and the third slide. So again, the context here is David's reign is coming to an end. He's going to pass the baton on to Solomon, and this is his worship towards the end of his reign as king. Am I about right on that?
Yeah.
Okay. So David praised the Lord in the presence of the whole assembly, saying, "Praise be to you, Lord, the God of our father Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power, and the glory and the majesty and the splendor, for everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. Wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and give strength to all. Now, our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name." Does this remind you of other passages you read in the Bible?
Well, like the Psalms.
Yes. The Psalms. What were you gonna say, Heather?
I was gonna say the Lord's Prayer, yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory.
Yes.
Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so you hear echoes or sort of, yeah, the Lord's Prayer is there, there's definitely some language that's pulled from there. And then Psalms. And so the Psalms are attributed to King David. He's said to have written them. And so this seems like something that David would write or say. And Ezra is recording David having said this, right? Yeah, it's a beautiful prayer of honoring God, right? Okay, so the next part. But who am I, and who are my people, that we should be able to give as generously as this? Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. We are foreigners and strangers in your sight, as were all our ancestors. Our days on earth are like a shadow without hope. Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a temple for your holy name comes from your hand, and all of it belongs to you. Anything jump out at you there?
To me, it seems strange that he says, we are foreigners and strangers in your sight, whereas in like the New Testament is God is our Father and he's always with us and we're his people. So that surprised me.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of being foreigners and strangers in their context, in their land, makes sense as sojourners, but to say we are foreigners and strangers in your sight, that is a little odd. I think there's probably a stewardship sermon in here somewhere, right? A reminder.
This would have been written at the time when wisdom literature was starting to make its presence known. And so you have, our days on earth are like a shadow without hope. Oh, this is like right out of Ecclesiastes.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
Lord of God, all building you a temple. Now, the thing about it is, David didn't build the temple.
Nope.
Solomon
built the temple.
Right, yeah.
And that's where we get into this last section of David's prayer. It says, I know, my God, that you test the heart and are pleased with integrity. All these things I have given willingly and with honest intent. And now I have seen with joy how willingly your people who are here have given to you. And this is the conclusion of this prayer. Lord, the God of our fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, keep these desires and thoughts in the hearts of your people forever, and keep their hearts loyal to you. And give my son Solomon a wholehearted devotion to keep your commands, statutes, and decrees, and to do everything to build the palatial structure for which I have provided. Right, so there's a passing on. And knowing David's story, the first part, verse 17, you test the heart and are pleased with integrity. All these things I have given willingly and with honest intent. Okay. Really, David? And now I've seen with joy how willingly your people. And so that combined with the previous one, to me, would make a beautiful stewardship sermon, right? Sort of our reminder that all we have comes from God and we give it back to God and we give it with joy. And so there's maybe that'll be the stewardship campaign as well. Anything else jump out at you?
I was thinking too, that we're gonna settle down and not move around so much. In other words, when you build something as big as the structure he's predicting there, you're gonna stand.
Oh, put down some roots, yeah.
The tents are gonna have to. He used in the backyard.
And David had to fight for that land. I mean, that's,
Yeah,
right?
and he intends to keep it then.
Anything else? So I think that this would be an appropriate lectionary passage, and in that sense, I'm a little bummed that First and Second Chronicles didn't get any play in the Revised Common Lectionary. There are a few other passages in First Chronicles that I think are not just genealogies and not just accounting of historic, but get into the heart of kind of what's written. All right, in Second Chronicles, so David passes the kingdom on to Solomon. Solomon becomes the king. What stories do we know about Solomon and his kingship and his rule? He was wise.
Yeah.
You know, what's the famous story about Solomon's wisdom? Right. Two women are arguing over whether or not a baby is theirs, and his resolution is, we'll just cut the baby in half, and one gets one half, the other gets the other half, and one woman says no. Solomon says, you're the real one, for you would forego, right? So, interesting you would point out Solomon's wisdom, because this is Solomon's wisdom prayer in Second Chronicles. And this is what jumped out at me when I was reading through here. This one's a little bit shorter than David's prayer, but I'll read this out loud to you, and then we can. This is at the very beginning of Second Chronicles, so Solomon has just taken over as king. That night God appeared to Solomon and said to him, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Solomon answered God, you have shown great kindness to David my father and have made me king in his place. Now, Lord God, let your promise to my father David be confirmed, for you have made me king over a people who are as numerous as the dust of the earth. Give me wisdom and knowledge, that I may lead this people, for who is able to govern this great people of yours? There's a second half to this, but we'll stop there for a second. Anything jump out at you there?
You can see he already has wisdom by his request when, ask for whatever you want me to give you. It could be a million things.
Right,
And his wisdom is that he's asking for more.
more wisdom. Not asking for riches, not asking for armies to vanquish enemies, right? You were onto something. Because we read the second half of this prayer, God said to Solomon, since this is your heart's desire, and you have not asked for wealth, possessions, or honor, nor for the death of your enemies, and since you have not asked for a long life, but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people over whom I have made you king. Therefore, wisdom and knowledge will be given you. And I will also give you wealth, possessions, and honor, such as no king who was before you have ever had, and none after you will have. So, God promises rich blessings because there is a purity of heart, right? And a wisdom, I think. Yeah. What do you think?
Seek ye first. Echoes that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. Yep. And all these things will be added unto you. Anything else? Anything else y'all want to talk about with the Revised Common? I thought I had enough material to fill an hour. Here we are at 45 minutes.
Well, I can't help but think that this might be getting further away than you want to go, but this is such perfect political propaganda for the time that it's being written, because we kind of think, oh, well, this is being written by sometime shortly after David. No, I mean, you got a group of people who just come back from Babylon. They are a ragtag bunch. Half of the Israelites or the Jews stayed in Babylon. And now they're trying to rebuild the temple, right? The temple is completely gone. And this is an attempt to say, look at our regal history. look at the world that we came from. Our father David, was so faithful to God, and Solomon had so much wisdom. And, this is infusing spiritual energy into a group of people who could barely put the stones of the temple, rebuilding it together without being attacked by Samaritans or things like that. I mean, it really required a lot of just a spiritual legacy for them to be inspired to do what they were doing. And that's what I'm reading there when I see that. It's just, this has no foothold in the history of David and Solomon. I'm sorry, for everyone who reads the Bible historically, it has a foothold in the history of the 5th and the 4th century.
Yes.
And that's the thing that's so interesting about it to me.
Yeah.
And the other thing and it actually said Abraham, Isaac, and Israel in the text. Interesting, because what they're trying to do is to completely wipe out the name of Jacob, which was the patriarch of the 10 tribes who were utterly lost.
Right.
And Israel was a name that they could hold fast to, which was another name for Jacob. But that name for Jacob, we're not part of those groups that group of people that turn their back on us, right?
Right.
And God punished them. But we hold this history of Judah so close to our hearts. And that's what we're going to be building our temple out of, right? That spiritual energy and that spiritual legacy. That's not the right word I'm looking for. The heritage, all of that. So I'm sorry to diss it by calling it propaganda. Maybe I could come up with another word, but it kind of is.
Well, it's certainly an attempt to write their history in a particular way.
Yeah.
Right? But that gets at the core of all written history is what facts are chosen, what facts are omitted, what opinions are presented as facts, right? And I think there's sometimes a hesitance to think that the Bible may have been written with that same human fallibility, but it was written by humans who had a particular idea or agenda that they wanted to get across, right?
Yeah, and that was what Ezra especially was trying to do. I mean, he had that whole task in front of him, How do I bring this people together
Right.
and not have them lose their identity?
Yeah.
How accessible would this be to the people at the time? Would Solomon have stood on a mountaintop and prayed this out loud? Or if it's sort of a propaganda,
Well,
how would they know?
Well, so what's being done here is this would be read by priests to a largely illiterate group of people. So we don't know. We don't have any historical evidence that David or Solomon ever existed. That their names aren't even mentioned in the annals of the history of the ancient Near East. So all of this is, we don't know. We have no idea. That's why archaeology is so important to us, because we can unearth, structures and just extrapolate from what we see in the concrete evidence. But we have no idea what Solomon would have done.
Is the assumption that Ezra is working from oral traditions that have been passed down, and he's reorganizing them and writing them down for the first time?
Yeah. He's all he can work from are the priests of the priestly tradition that tried to stay alive during the Babylonian captivity. And that tradition was associated with the first temple.
Right. That
traditionally it is believed that Solomon built, and most likely there was a Solomon who built this temple and everything. But Ezra is trying to introduce to the people this idea that the temple is the center of our life, but you are all priests as well. There's a kind of a priesthood of all believers here, and that's why the emphasis on purity is so important. You know, we're gonna build this temple, but one of the problems we had in the past was it became too heavy with priests, but all of you are gonna be priests, right? I mean, we want you to follow the law, and they would read the law every day in the temple precincts or where the temple was being built. And the reason I say this is because this is where we're gonna pick up when we look at my text, which is Daniel.
Oh.
Yeah. Part of Daniel is read in the lectionary, but the part that you know so well about Daniel is never read in church on Sunday. That's Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You'll never hear that from the pulpit.
Well, if a pastor is just using lecture.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly. Revised Common Lectionary, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I'm sorry for my little, my brain is just going here, because this ties a lot of things together.
Yeah.
But, and I hate to make it seem like this never happened, but this is a sermon. This isn't a historical, this is a sermon that Ezra was putting down to the people. Not necessarily something that David ever said. But,
Yeah.
but it's in the tradition of David.
Right.
Go ahead, Sharon.
And kind of the flip side of that is, but it was important enough to keep, right? In other words, over the years, this was the story, these are the words chosen, however it got passed along. And it's fascinating to know that it was kept, and some probably many times interpreted differently than we do today, but, and what we've made of it over time.
Yeah.
And on a more whimsical note, that this is our stewardship year, that stewardship appeals have been happening since the time of David, right?
Indeed. Yes, indeed. Yeah, there's a lot of, I've used Old Testament texts as stewardship themes in the past, because there's actually a lot of very rich material there. And it's about acknowledging God's blessings and acknowledging our dependence on God, which is really at the core of stewardship, right? Is that we become very we think we're self-made and self-independent, and we have to take a step back and realize that a lot has gone into all that we have and all that we are.
I'm reminded of my very first religion course way back in undergraduate at Assumption College in Worcester, where I had my mind blown by a professor who, let me know that God didn't actually write all of these things, humans did. But then went on to explain that, at least the way that the church tried to understand that and make sense of it, was that there was truth underlying these writings, and that we were constantly trying to sift through the Bible and try to pick out, what are the truths that God wants us to get out of this. And I think if we think of this Chronicles as Ezra's attempt to take what he knew and sort of bring out the things that he thought, or that God was inspiring in him to pick out and say, okay, folks, this is what you need to focus on: purity, our legacy as a priesthood, or our role as a priesthood, that kind of thing. I think that helps.
I love that, and that's absolutely right. Like, our understanding of history in the 21st century, like, if we try to overlay that understanding onto the Bible and try to treat this as a history textbook that counts dates and times of particular events that lead to different things, I think we're off base, because that's not how it was written. And if we go back and look at texts that were written 600 years before the birth of Christ, or 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, or even around the time of the birth of Christ, there was a fundamentally different understanding of how you record events. And it was not based on, I think the last time I had an actual history textbook was in high school. My history classes I took in college, we did different ways of reading history, right? But like a textbook, and I remember like growing up in Arizona, freshman year was history of Arizona, sophomore year was world history, and junior year was U.S. history, which prepared us to take the U.S. history AP exam, as I recall. But we had an actual textbook that, in the beginning, right, when Arizona started in the state. But even then, my history teacher never challenged the assumptions in the textbook of the native peoples who were there before and what their history might have been, even though it may not have been a history of times and dates, but they tell their history of their own creation story, and they tell their history of natural events that occurred, but they do it in their own way. And that's the same context in which the Bible is written. We can't assume, and when we refer to Chronicles and Kings as historical books, if we try to read them in a history textbook, we're going to get it wrong, right? It does, as I pointed out in these outlines, it does attempt to walk through historical events. But scholars are the ones who have overlaid times and dates on those. Those are not there because it's telling a story of a people. And there's truth in the story of the people, right? But not in the form of a historical textbook, right? And our call as thinking, loving Christians is to read this in an attempt to discern the truth of the history of God's people and God's love for the world and God's love for God's people, and figure out what that means for us and how these stories relate. And so David's prayer recounts some of that and gives us some of that truth. And Solomon's prayer for wisdom is another piece of that. And so these are all important parts. And perhaps part of the reason they aren't included in the Revised Common Lectionary, right? Because it requires an hour-long conversation to get at that. And if I just stood up and preached David's prayer and didn't provide the historical context on either side of it, would it be as meaningful? But when we can sit and have an hour-long conversation about it, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I see. Yeah, this is part of God's story and the story of God's people, and I'm part of that story. And how do I read myself into the text and vice versa, right? And so, yeah, that's a really, really good point, Bob. I don't know where these Bibles came from.
They miraculously appeared
Oh, yeah, this
in the
is
night.
part of the creation of the Lydia room, to have a set of Bibles. So. All right, anything else?
This might be a topic for another day, but as a teacher of language, I'm interested to know, like, how many translations has scripture been through before it got to us? I mean, just in my lifetime, there have been so many different translations and updates. How many languages did it go through? What was it originally written in? Did it go from Hebrew to Latin to German to English? And maybe what got lost in translation, because we know a lot gets lost when you go from one language to another.
Yeah, yes to all of that, Linda. Yeah.
And what a language was originally spoken in,
Right.
because it was most likely oral tradition first, and
Right.
that carries with it a different dimension as well.
And it was only the priestly class and scholars that were literate enough to be able to write it down. And they would write it in formal Hebrew, which is not the language that was necessarily spoken by the people. And so, yeah, these texts would have originally been written by priests in Hebrew as they were sort of transcribing an oral tradition, right? And then we find fragments of these texts. Most of the Bibles that we use here in our church, scholars are going back to the original Hebrew when they do our English translation. So they're not using a Latin Vulgate or a German translation. They're the NRSV, which is the primary Bible we use in this church. The scholars go right back to the original texts. And there's actually a new NRSV that's coming out this year, the new Revised Standard Version, which is what we have. in some of our church, we have the Revised Standard Version, which is the same thing, scholars going back to the original text. And there's a
Newer.
newer NRSV that's coming out this year, and there's a lot of bubbling talk about that in groups that I'm a part of. Do we need to be replacing our pew Bibles with this one, that sort of thing. So, but it's a very good question. I encountered some folks who only use the King James Version of the Bible. They believe that is the translation that God has given to humanity, and it ends there. That was the ultimate translation. Well, it turns out when the 1500s, I think, I don't know my British history. When was King James?
1611.
1611. I was close.
Yeah.
So 1611. It turns out since 1611, we have found a lot more original manuscripts in ancient Hebrew and Greek. And so as we have newer translations, they are informed by the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are informed by additional manuscripts, which allow us to have more insight into the original texts. And so it's not the King James Version scholars who wrote the King James translation in 1611 had all the tools available to them at that time. There have been more tools that have developed in the last 400 years. And so and more texts have been discovered. And so we're able to, and so the King James Version is a useful version of the Bible. And it also, there's language there that's beautiful. Some of the translations of the Psalms are some of the most poetic, and I don't like the newer translations of the Psalms. What the scholars who did the NRSV would tell you is that these are truer to the original Hebrew, but the original Hebrew was also written in the form of a poem, and so making it poetry is not a bad thing. And how does that work with the original intent of it? So those are really good questions and would be a good topic for a future forum. And maybe Dan will address some of those next week.
Yeah, I'd love to.
So it's 10:15. I need to go get ready to lead worship. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. This is a rich conversation. Now you know a little bit more about how David and I pick our texts, and also about which texts you never hear from, at least in the Revised Common Lectionary.
I put a plug for the podcast, because every once in a while you guys get into some of this.
We do?
In your podcast. It's
Yeah.
kind of fun.
So each, generally Mondays, David and I record a podcast where we have a 30 to 45 minute conversation about the texts. And we do sometimes get into these issues. And so those are available. So, all right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.